Hello Dungeon Delvers, welcome to Gamertopia. For the past few days I've been doing a ton of runs through the Abattoir of Zir trying to figure out what the best build for Sorcerer is, and I think I've found a pretty decent one. This build will get you at least through tier 10, will make farming lower tiers a walk in the park. Quick and easy clears means higher levels for the tiers of Blood Glyph and more damage output. Before we get into the build, if you plan on using this build or are looking for more Diablo content, subscribe to my channel. It helps me out a lot and keeps you up to date with all of my future videos. Let's get on with the build. Prior to the skills, there is one very important thing that has helped me stay alive more consistently, and since we only get one chance to clear Abattoirs of Zir, I would say this is pretty big. We are going to be using a lot of ball lightning, and with all those damage numbers flying around, sometimes they can get in the way of some of the animations of exploding enemies, and there is nothing worse than making it 90% through your run to be one shot by an exploding enemy that you didn't even know was exploding in the first place. With that said, go into your game options and under gameplay, click on the drop-down menu for combat text display mode, and make sure to change it to hide damage numbers. This is going to help out a lot. Now let's check out the skills. We are going to start off with 2 ranks in Firebolt, and this will be our first enchantment. This is going to make it so we are constantly causing fire damage each time we are attacking an enemy. Next, we'll put 1 point into Charged Bolts, and then we'll take Enhanced Charged Bolts, which gives every 3 Charged Bolts cast and AoE damage effect. We'll also take Destructive Charged Bolts, which is going to reduce the damage output of enemies hit by Charged Bolts by 25%, which will increase our survivability. We won't be directly casting this skill, but we will be having quite a few of them sent out through our ultimate skills, which I'll come back to in a few moments. Now we are going to take 1 rank of Devastation, which is going to increase our mana by 3, and open up Elemental Dominance, which we will be taking 3 ranks of. This will increase our ball lightning damage output by 9% whenever we cast it above 50 mana. Moving on to our defensive tree, we're going to take 1 rank of Flame Shield, which will give us immunity and a little bit of fire damage output. We'll also take Enhanced Flame Shield for the 25% movement speed increase, and Shimmering Flame Shield, which will heal us for 50% of our missing life when we cast the skill. Notice it does say missing life, so if you have a maximum of 15,000 health, this is not going to heal you for 7,500 health every time you cast it. It's based on how much health you're missing at the time of the cast. Regardless, this is going to be huge for helping us with our survivability. Next, we are going to take 1 rank of Teleport with Enhanced Teleport to decrease the cooldown by 0.5 seconds for each enemy hit up to 3 seconds. And we'll also take Shimmering Teleport, which is going to give us 30% damage reduction for 3 seconds each time we use Teleport. And with this build, we will be using it quite a bit. For the next skill, we will be using Ice Armor to further help us with our survivability, but only put a point in this skill if you do not have a Harlequin Crest. If you do have it, we will just use the passive +4 to all skills to allow us to use this skill. If you don't need to use this point here because you have a Harlequin Crest, we will be using it in the next tree. Before we get to that, we're going to want to put 1 point into Elemental Attunement to give us 5% chance to reset the cooldown of one of our defensive skills. And then in our Conjuration tree, we're going to put 1 rank into Ice Blades, which will give us our frost damage output and a 40% chance to cause vulnerability. We'll also take Enhanced Ice Blades to reduce our Ice Blades cooldown by 0.5 seconds each time they hit a vulnerable enemy. And then we'll take Summoned Ice Blades, which is going to give us 20% of our Ice Blades cooldown reduction to all of our other skills as well. Ice Blades is going to be our second enchantment, which will spawn an additional Ice Blades whenever we use 40 seconds worth of cooldowns from our skills. Now we'll be taking some passives, starting off with Precision Magic. Here you will either take 2 or 3 ranks depending on if you're using Harlequin Crest and had to use that point in Ice Armor. This will either give you a 10 or 15% increase to your lucky hit chance. Then we'll take 3 ranks of Conjuration Mastery, which will increase our damage output by 3% for each conjuration we have active. And we'll also take 1 rank of Align the Elements for 3% damage reduction for each second you are not taking damage from an elite, up to 40%. This likely will not do much for this build and specifically in Abattoirs of Zir, but it opens us up to take 3 ranks of Mana Shield for 21% damage reduction for 5 seconds each time we use 100 mana. This will be a constant effect since we will be using 100 mana more often than every 5 seconds. And we'll also use 3 ranks of Protection, which will give us a barrier for 30% of our health each time we use a cooldown. Now for the Mastery skill tree, we will be maxing out Ball Lightning, of course, for maximum damage output. We'll also take Enhanced Ball Lightning to increase the damage rate of our Ball Lightning skill by 200% of our movement speed. And we'll also use Wizard's Ball Lightning to give us a crackling energy each time an enemy is hit by a ball lightning 4 times. For the passives in the Master tree, we'll take 1 rank of Inner Flames, which won't do much for this build, but it will open up Devouring Blaze, which we will max out. Devouring Blaze will increase our critical strike damage on any enemy who is burning, and this will be all of them because of the Firebolt enchantment. We'll also take 1 rank of Static Discharge, which will give us a 5% chance to drop a crackling energy whenever we critically hit an enemy with a shock skill. We'll also max out Invigorating Conduit to give us 12 mana every time we pick up a crackling energy. In the ultimate skill tree, we'll use Unstable Currents, which casts a bunch of additional skills while it's active. We'll also take Prime Unstable Currents for the 25% attack speed increase, and Supreme Unstable Currents to increase the pulses of our crackling energy by 25% and cause them to cost no charges. We will also max out Fiery Surge, which is going to give us a 45% increase to our mana regeneration. When we kill a burning enemy, all of our enemies will be burning from the Firebolt enchantment, so this will be constant. We'll also take 1 rank of Coursing Currents to give us a 1% increase to our crit chance, and we'll be maxing out Electrocution as well. This is going to cause enemies to do 15% less damage output after being critically hit with a shock skill. Lastly, we're going to be using Veer's Mastery for our key passive. This passive is still bugged at the time of me creating this video, so close enemies are not taking increased damage, but they are doing 20% decreased damage to us, so it ends up being worth it. Now onto the Paragon board. For our starting board, we'll go up to the left to take the Resilience node, but then from there, we'll work our way towards the Glyph socket through the right path. Make sure to grab the magic node to the right for the increased elemental resistance. Our first glyph that we're going to use here is going to be the Elementalist glyph, which will give us an additional 22.5% non-physical damage and 6.7 resistance to all elements. These are coming from the Erudite node, the Elemental Balance node, and also these 4 magic nodes here. The glyph will also increase our damage output by 5% for each fire, cold, and lightning type damages we do to an enemy. Now we'll move up to the next board, which is going to be the Enchantment Master board. We'll work our way over towards the Glyph socket, and we'll use Reinforced for this one. This glyph will give us an increased 25% non-physical damage, 7.5% resistance to all elements, and plus 25 intelligence. These are all coming from the second Elemental Balance and Erudite nodes. This glyph is also going to give us a 15% damage reduction whenever we have a barrier active. You'll also want to take the Elementalist and Ruinous rare nodes for the increased damage output and maximum life increase. After that, we'll exit the board to the right. The next board we'll be taking is the Burning Instinct board. This is where we'll be using the new Tears of Blood glyph. We'll head down to the Glyph socket, and we're pretty much going to fill out this board for all the nodes within range in order to maximize the damage output from the Tears of Blood glyph. After that, we'll head up towards the top exit point, and we'll take the Kindling rare node to increase our damage to burning enemies, which is going to be all of them, and the increased damage to elites. We'll also take the Safeguard and Keeper of Flames rare nodes to increase our damage reduction from burning enemies, which again is going to be all of them. The next board we'll be using is the Static Surge board. As we head towards the Glyph socket, we'll take the Paralyzing node to increase our damage to stunned enemies, along with the surrounding magic nodes to further increase this damage and give us a small boost to our maximum mana. The glyph for this board is going to be Destruction, which is going to give us 115% critical strike damage increase, and you'll also want to grab the Incapacitate rare node along with these surrounding nodes to further increase the damage to stunned enemies, and the Dexterity nodes, which will allow for the bonus from the Destruction glyph, which gives us a 12% damage increase to enemies that are hit with critical strikes. Now we'll head back to the Burning Instinct board and attach the Frigid Fate board to the bottom. Rather than heading straight down towards the Glyph socket for this one, we'll head over to the right here so we can take the Oppressive rare node and the surrounding magic nodes. This is going to increase the damage output and damage reduction for vulnerable enemies. Then we'll head down back over to the Glyph socket and use the Adept glyph here. This is going to give our Ball Lightning a 79% increased damage output, and it's also going to give our Ball Lightning an increased area, but it isn't 20% like it says. I can't tell you exactly what the percentage is, but this is another bug that hasn't been fixed yet. Now we'll head over to the Legendary node, which will give us a percentage increased damage output based on the amount of bonus damage you do with cold. After this, we'll exit the board to the right and attach our 6th board, which is going to be the Ceaseless Conduit board. For this one, since we're closing in on the last of our Paragon points, we'll head right to the Glyph socket, which is going to be Territorial, and this is going to give us an increased damage output of 57% and damage resistance of 15% for close enemies. You'll also want to take the Galvanic Catalyst node and the surrounding magic nodes for the increased lightning damage. For our vampiric powers, we are going to use Ravenous for the 20% chance to increase our attack speed by 40% of our movement speed, Infection to cause poison damage to enemies, Accursed Touch to cause Vampiric Curse, Prey on the Weak to cause enemies inflicted with Vampiric Curse to become vulnerable, and also increase our damage output by 16% to those vulnerable enemies. And lastly, Domination to increase our damage output to stunned and immobilized enemies. For gear, I am using a Shaco, but if you do not have one, it isn't necessary. I would suggest using the Mage Lord's defensive aspect on your helmet though for the increase to damage reduction from close enemies. With the right roll on a helmet, this may even be an upgrade from the Uber Unique. For the chest, we'll be using Raiment of the Infinite. This is going to give us some crowd control with the stunning and pulling effect of Teleport. The increased damage to stunned and close enemies is also a plus. For gloves, I'm using Fists of Fate. I was hesitant to use these at first, but they do work pretty well. If you are lucky enough to get a roll of 300, which I clearly have not been, you'll do an average of 50% increased damage. Also, the lucky hit to immobilize will further help our Domination vampiric power since it allows for 24% increased damage to immobilized enemies. For pants, we'll be using Tybalt's Will, which further increase our damage output and damage reduction. We'll also get up to 40% increased damage output whenever we teleport from these. I wish I could fit the Metamorphosis vampiric power in this build somewhere, since it also gives us the unstoppable effect when we evade, and we are going to be evading a lot in this build, but I wasn't getting as good of an outcome as I thought I would from this. For the boots, we'll be using Flicker Step. The movement speed and damage reduction from these are nice, but if you have to choose between a good roll and those stats or a good roll for the ultimate skill cooldown reduction, I would definitely go with the cooldown reduction. With this build, you can get to a point where your ultimate skill is up for the majority of the dungeon, and the easier it is to achieve that, the easier the dungeon will be to complete. The flicker set boots are definitely essential for this build. For the amulet, you'll want to use disobedience aspect to increase your armor up to 99%, and for Abattoir of Zir, you're definitely going to want to be using the highest roll for this aspect. You'll also want to have increased movement speed, armor, ranks of mastery skill, and devouring blaze. The first ring is going to be Telrash's loop, which is going to give us increased damage for each element type we damage an enemy with. All of our attacks are going to be causing burning damage from the firebolt enchantment. Our ice blaze will be doing the cold damage, teleport and ball lightning will be doing the shock damage, and we'll also be getting poison damage from the infection vampiric power. So with a good roll on this ring, that can mean 60% damage increase. On the next ring, you'll want to use gravitational aspect so your ball lightning circle you, and you'll receive the increased damage. You'll also want critical strike chance, lightning critical strike damage, lucky hit chance, and maximum life. If you're feeling tanky enough, you could swap out the maximum life for cooldown reduction. For weapons, I had been using a Havarian, which you certainly can use if you have it for the first few tiers, but I started seeing diminishing returns with it after about tier 8. After tier 8, I opted for a dagger for the 30% damage to close enemies with the storm spell aspect, which will give us increased damage output to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. We are pretty much always going to have a barrier with this build, so that is going to be often. You'll also want the dagger to have mastery skill damage and damage to burning enemies on it. For the offhand, I'm using conceited aspect, which further increases our damage while we have a barrier. You'll also want to have crit chance, mana cost reduction, resource generation, and cooldown reduction. As far as how to play this build, specifically for Abattoir of Zir, you'll want to use your teleport often to stun enemies and pull them together, and then start spamming ball lightning. Use ice blaze as often as you can because this is going to decrease your cooldowns for all your other skills. Keep overwhelming currents active as often as possible, and then dodge through enemies while you're burning them down to decrease the cooldown of your next overwhelming currents. Use ice armor and teleport to keep your barrier up, and keep flame shield to release yourself from a crowd control you might receive, and also if you get in any kind of sticky situation. Let me know in the comments how your experience with Abattoirs of Zir has been, and definitely let me know if you're going to use this build.